Hi, girls and boys. We're back with Pax. So you remember Peter had to leave his pet fox by the side of the road because his dad insisted that the fox become more safe in its surroundings. And he wasn't a wild fox. He had been tamed under Peter's care. So I don't know if he's going to make it in the wild woods, but let's find out. So we're in chapter 4. Not hunting for his grandfather's flashlight, that was the first mistake of the trip. So remember, Peter had packed up a backpack full of things, and he was going to go back and try to find Pax. But remember, it was 300 miles, and if you made like a cut through the mountains, it would only be 200 miles. That's a lot of walking. The moon had lit Peter's way for maybe 2 hours before it had drowned beneath thick clouds. He had stumbled along in the dark for another hour before giving up. He'd slid open the sides of a garbage bag to make a long mat and cut the other one to wear as a poncho against the cold mist, and slept beside a culvert, his baseball mitt for a pillow. Actually slept was a wild overstatement, and when the first low sun rays stabbed his eyelids, he awakened cold and wet from whatever dozing he had managed. His first thoughts were of Pax. Where was he this morning? Was he wet or cold too? Was he afraid? "I'm coming," he said out loud as he rolled the garbage bags back into his pack. "Hold on, Pax." He ate a stick of cheese and a couple of crackers, slugged a long drink of water, then laced his boots and climbed up to the road. He was stiff and sore, but at least his anxiety had relaxed its grip. He probably hadn't traveled much more than 7 or 8 miles, but there was still a whole day before his grandfather would get home from work and even suspect that he was gone. According to the atlas map, he probably had another 20 miles to go before hitting the highway. After that, he could turn west for the shortcut anywhere that looked promising. He'd sleep deep in the woods tonight, out of civilization, the riskiest part of the trip behind him. He wished he had paid more attention as he had driven with his father the day before. Mistake number 2. But he only recalled there'd been a single sleepy town. Right after that, they had exited the highway, and then stretches of woodlands broken only by occasional farms. Peter walked for 5 full hours. Blisters formed on his heels, and his shoulders ached from the backpack. But every step brought him closer to Pax, and the home he should never have left, and he felt hopeful. Until a little after noon, when he hit a cluster of buildings that passed for a town square. Immediately, it seemed every person he passed was eyeing him suspiciously, wondering why he wasn't in the school that he had noticed a little while back. When a woman dragging a toddler stopped to stare outright, Peter pretended to study the window display in the hardware store beside him. In the glass, he saw his reflection, and the remnants of his hopeful mood melted. His hair was tangled with leaves, his sweatshirt streaked in mud, and his nose reddened with what promised to be a full-face sunburn by the end of the day. The kid in the window looked like a runaway, one who hadn't prepared very well. He sensed the woman moving on, but before he could leave, a shadow loomed over his shoulder. "You need something, young man?" Peter looked up. A man in a blue jacket, emblazoned with the store logo, stood in the doorway smoking. His arms were crossed over a sagging belly, and his hair was a thinning gray. But something about the way he was peering down his nose reminded Peter of a hawk he had once seen searching for prey from the top of a cedar tree. He pointed to the window. Peter looked back at the display, seed packets and gardening tools. "Oh, no," said Peter. "I was just, do you sell flashlights?" The man kind of cocked his head and eyed Peter while he took a drag on a cigarette, and again Peter was reminded of that hawk. Finally he nodded. "Yep, Aisle 7. No school today? A lunch break. I gotta hurry back. The man stubbed out his cigarette and followed Peter inside the store, hovering nearby while Peter chose the cheapest flashlight on the rack and a pair of AA batteries, and even shadowed him as he checked out. Outside, Peter let out the breath he hadn't known he had been holding. He wedged everything into his backpack and headed back for the intersection. Hey, kid! Peter froze. The man had followed him outside. He yanked a thumb over his shoulder. The school's that way. Peter waved and smiled, trying to act dopey and change direction. At the corner, he risked a glance over his shoulder. The man was still watching him. Peter took off, sudden trickles of sweat chilling the back of his neck. He didn't stop running until he reached the school entrance and then cut for the parking lot. All he wanted to do was hide for a couple of minutes, maybe crouch between a couple of pickup trucks and figure out an escape route. But beyond the parking lot and the utility buildings, he saw something a whole lot more appealing. A baseball diamond carved into the lime green spring grass, and tucked along the third baseline, facing away from the school, was an empty dugout. Peter stood at the top of the rise, looking down at the sight. He argued with himself for only a minute. He'd like to be moving for sure, making better time, but what if that guy had called the police? Hitting the road would be risky. Any time he rested, he could easily make up at night, since he had a flashlight now. And he was suddenly tired, bone-dead tired. Mostly, though, it was the way the field looked so welcoming, as if it were inviting him. Peter always felt good on a baseball field, and maybe that was a sign. He didn't think he believed in signs, but after the Coyotes last night, he wasn't sure that he didn't. Peter adjusted his backpack and loped down the hill. In the dugout, the familiar mingled scents of leather, sweat, and stale bubble gum wrapped around him like a hug. Peter hurried into his other set of clothes and rubbed a handful of clay-red dirt through his hair. When he left here, he sure wasn't going to look like any description the police might know. He filled his thermos from a water fountain, drank it all down, and filled it again. As he wiggled under the bench, he smiled, realizing that Pax would have chosen the same spot, protected, but with a good vantage point if he wanted a rest. An hour, that was all, and then he'd cut behind the school and pick up the road again. Enough time, he thought, that if the police had been called, they would lose interest. He arranged his baseball glove and lowered his head. Just an hour, he murmured. I won't even close my eyes. I'm just going to rest here for an hour. Well, you know what happens when you lay and close your eyes most of the time. All right, I'm going to start this next chapter. We'll see how far we get. This is my territory. So remember, we're in Pax's point of view now. This is my territory. Pax was so startled that he nearly toppled from the oak trunk he had been drowsing on. All day he had been keeping watch and seen nothing larger than a grasshopper. And now here was a bright-furred vixen. He had never seen another fox before, but he knew, younger and smaller and a female. But a fox. Instinct told him also that the way she held her ears and tails up meant she expected his submission. I hunt here, was the meaning. Pax felt an urge to run back to his crude nest and press himself into the remaining stalks as if retreating to his pen, but he resisted. What if his boy came back and he wasn't here? He flattened his ears to show he meant no threat, but that he wasn't going to leave. The vixen paced over, and Pax drew in her scent, as familiar as his own. She sniffed and bristled in distrust at the human scent that was on him. Pax had been born with that same instinct as well, But distrust is no match for kindness administered consistently and unmeasured, especially in creatures new to the world. Pax had only been 16 days old when Peter had rescued him. A fatherless, motherless curl of charcoal fur, his eyes barely opened, and it wasn't long before he'd come to trust the quiet, gangly boy who had brought him home. The vixen now poked her pointed snout in to sniff him more closely, and bristled again. "The scent is my boy's. Have you seen him?" Pax shared the most important features of his human. The round ears, the towering legs, so improbably long that Pax always feared he would topple over when he ran. The black curled hair that grew to different lengths and then became short again. "No humans are here, but they are approaching." Just then, Bristle's head rose as if jerked on an unseen wire. Her ears pricked, trained on a slight rustling in a nearby tuft of broom sedge like a bush. He reared, her back began to twitch, gathering energy. She sprang high and then, paws tight over her black nose, dived into the grass with a flash of white-tipped tail. Pax sat up alert. In a second, Bristle's head reappeared, and in her jaws was a wood rat. She leaped clear off the grass, bit through the rat's neck, and then dropped it to the ground. Orphaned before he had been weaned, Pax had never eaten raw prey. His hunger rose at the blood scent, and so did his curiosity. He took a cautious step closer, but Bristle growled, and Pax retreated to watch her from a safe distance. He grew hungrier as she crunched the bites. He thought of the brimming comfort of his bowl full of kibble bits, the pleasure of Peter's hand-fed treats, and the ultimate reward, peanut butter. He needed to find his boy. His boy would feed him. Before he could ask about the approaching humans, Bristle picked up what remained of the rat, a single hind leg with its long tail, and she stalked off with it dangling from her jaw. Pax watched as she wove her way between the grass tufts, becoming only flashes of flame and white. Leaving, he was swept by the memory of his human's car roaring away in the stinging spray of gravel. Just before she slipped into a fringe of ferns at the wood's edge, she paused to glance at him over her shoulder. At that moment, a sharp snap from the fallen oak startled her. It was followed by a red streak of fur that hurtled from the dried foliage, flew over the weeds, and landed on her back. Pax flattened himself. He could hear the vixen yips as she scuffled with her attacker, but they sounded more irritated than afraid. He poked his head up. Bristle pounced on a ball of fur and bit it hard. To Pax's surprise, a smaller, skinnier version of herself unfurled at her paws. Pax was stunned. Never had he suspected that foxes might soar like birds, whose swooping arcs were not like any movement he had himself thought. The little fox flipped to its back and gave his belly in submission, but this seemed only to make Bristle angrier, her chattering now punctuated by jabs and nips. Pax bounded over, overcome by curiosity. The skinny fox startled at the unfamiliar human scent and looked over Bristle's shoulder. His eyes widened when he spied Pax, and he scrambled to his paws. Friendly, he announced to Pax, brother but not littermate of the vixen. Play. Bristle bared her teeth and snarled at her brother. Dangerous. Stay away, she sang. Pax ignored Bristle's warning, posture, and met the greeting. Friendly, you flew like a bird, he motioned. The little fox bounded back to the fallen oak and then sprang onto its trunk, one fork of the dead tree angled up. The small fox walked lightly along its length. He looked down to make sure Pax was watching. Okay, we have to stop there for right now. So maybe Pax has found a friend through the vixen's Bristle, that's what he calls her, through Bristle's brother. So now there are 3 foxes in the woods, Pax, Bristle, and her little brother, who we don't know the name of yet. So that might be good for Pax to now have some friends. Okay, stay tuned.